समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
What's the current war in the Gulf region about? What is any war in the Gulf region about? It's about one of two things. Either it's about oil and gas, a large percentage of the global storehouse of hydrocarbons sits in this limited real estate. Second reason for which wars take place in this region is the protection of Israel. Israel was a state that came into being between the First and the Second World War, and since then has been at odds with a lot of the neighbors, particularly in the Islamic world. Initially, it was also at war with other Arab countries which are not exactly coming in from an Islamic motivation, but more from a left Baathist motivation, and therefore aligned with the Soviet Union. Two things have led to wars in this region. One, as I told you, oil and gas, which is who controls oil and gas, and does oil and gas flow freely to buyers in the rest of the world from here or not, because there is dependence all over the world on these hydrocarbons, this source of energy. The second is Israel. Israel has fought wars in the past with Egypt, Syria, Iraq, indirectly because Iraqis joined in 1973 with Jordan. Jordan is not an oil country. Egypt is not an oil country. Syria is not an oil country that Israel fought with. Iraq is an oil country, but Iraq only joined indirectly in the 1973 war. Protection of Israel, therefore, has been the second reason why wars have broken out in this region. In those wars also, protection of Israel, the Arab countries, the big oil-bearing Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, etc., have not participated directly in the war. They may have supported the Palestinian cause, or at the most, they would have given diplomatic support, lip sympathy, and maybe economic support to the Palestinian cause. But they have stayed out of trouble in fighting with Israel. Also because over time they've become very tightly knit allies and in some ways protectorates of the Western powers. Jordan has been a protectorate, not formally, but in many ways of the British authority, linked to the larger Western power with the US, and Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, etc. They've been hosting American military power, and they've been protected by the American military powers. So any war for the protection of Israel has been limited either to Israel's neighbors. Those neighbors have signed peace accords with Israel and recognized it, barring Syria. Syria is in a different situation now. That is why the warfare with Israel has been taken over by the Iranians. It's the Iranians who are located far away from Israel who've taken the mantle of the Palestinian cause. Again, why do they do it? That is to show up the Arab power, saying you guys, Arab guys, Gulfi Arabs may be rich, but you don't want to fight for Palestine. We are willing to fight for Palestine. We are also willing to raise groups to fight for Palestine or to get the Israelis out. They want the destruction of Israel. That is when a war takes place for the defense of Israel or the protection of Israel. The second reason I told you is for the protection of oil and gas. But what happens when both combine? The examples for war for oil, only for oil or primarily for oil, you don't have to go far. Look at the first Gulf War. The first Gulf War of 1991, that is when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and occupied it. And that's when the Americans, they also got the UN sanction for this. They put together a multinational force to liberate Kuwait. That was purely for oil and for protecting the supply of oil and gas from this region to the rest of the world. At this point, what we are seeing is that both motives have combined. It is the protection of Israel, starting with October 7, 2023 attacks. Israel has launched an attack on Hamas, after that Hezbollah, and then the Houthis. And these were the proxies of Iran, or members of the Iranian Ring of Fire. These also included many Shia groups that Iran built in Iraq as well. All of them Israel has been attacking and has been at war with. In that war, Israel has wide Western support, directly American support without American direct involvement. Then it got expanded to Iran, about Iran's nuclear weapons program, and that's when the Americans also came in last year in June during the 12-day war, when on the last day the Americans came and they carried out bombing at the Fordo underground facility and 2 other nuclear facilities, and Trump said the war is over. Today we have come to a situation where the two things have combined. And how have they combined? Because Israel, first of all, decided to launch a sizable attack again. Israel concluded that what they had done in June last year had not finished the problem for them, that Iran had the capability of building the nukes again if it so wanted, that their capability of enriching uranium had not been fully destroyed. In any case, there was no commitment from the Ayatollahs that they will not do it going ahead. And if anything, the Ayatollahs or the Iranian regime was building new missiles, better missiles, ballistic missiles, also hypersonic missiles that would become very difficult to block, and that in any case would be too expensive to block, because these missiles are much cheaper. These drones in any case are much cheaper than the instruments that you use to block them or to intercept them far enough from your territory and your population centers. That is how the Israelis started this war again on Iran, and this time the Americans, Donald Trump, joined them immediately. That's how this war started. One, America called it Epic Fury, and Israel called it the Roaring Lion. Now, what happens? Once again, if you understand that wars are either about protection of Israel or protection of Israeli interest or protecting oil and gas supplies, what happens when the two get combined? When the two get combined, the other side uses the leverage that it has. For Iran, that leverage is to be able to block the supply of oil and gas to the rest of the world. Iran is firing missiles at Israel. They are causing some damage. Many are being intercepted. Even those that are intercepted, they are so large that their fragments fall. They cause some damage. However, Israel's civil defense is very good. Their population is very well trained. So large-scale population casualties are not possible so far. Those haven't taken place. But Israel remains embattled. That itself is not something that gives Iran sufficient leverage, particularly when the Americans have got involved, when the entire Iranian leadership, the regime's leadership, has been wiped out in bombing, particularly in the first days of bombing when Ayatollah Khamenei himself was killed. In that situation, Iran has now unveiled its strongest card. That is to be able to block the supply of oil and gas from this region to the rest of the world. Because in any case, Iran's oil production has been sanctioned. Iran's oil sales have been sanctioned. Almost no country is buying any oil and gas from Iran except the Chinese, who don't care about the sanctions. And also maybe some bit of it gets smuggled to Pakistan across land borders and also across the sea through coastal waters in small boats, etc. But that's not very much. Iran, therefore, does not have such a big interest right now in freely flowing oil and gas from this region. Iran is sitting on its own reserves. It's not allowed to take it out simply because, and if it's not allowed to sell it, why should they take it out? Because some of their neighbors also have plenty of hydrocarbons. Azerbaijan has plenty of hydrocarbons. And going further, Russia has enormous hydrocarbons, and many of the former Soviet republics either have their own sources and they can buy it from Russia as well. It's in this situation that Iran says, all right, maybe I can't fight you in the air. I can't fight you normally in the water like navy to navy. I cannot fight you on the ground, or maybe I don't even need to fight you on the ground because you will not send your ground troops here. But I can deny the waters to you. And that marvel of geology is something called the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Hormuz, where does the name come from? Hormuz, from whatever I read, it comes from Ahura Mazda, the god of the Zoroastrians or Parsis. Iran or Persia, as it used to be, was a Zoroastrian kingdom. For hundreds of years, the predominant religion in Persia was the Zoroastrians. The Zoroastrian power was first destroyed by Alexander in 331 BC. That's when the beautiful city of Persepolis was laid waste. In fact, I had the opportunity to walk through those ruins when we went to Iran on a 2-day visit with Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Alexander, however, did not bring any religion. He took some elements of Zoroastrianism with him. He died in Babylon in Iraq on his way back after his little misadventure in India with Porus. And then the Zoroastrian Empire came back. The Zoroastrians continued to rule Persia. Finally, in the era of the Sassanid Empire, that was defeated when Persia was conquered in 7th century AD by Islamic power. And since then, Iran has become almost entirely a Muslim country. And we'll talk about some of this, Iran's diversity, maybe in a CTC episode in a couple of days from now, maybe even tomorrow, maybe the next one. However, in 7th century, Islamic power took over Iran and this became the Shia Islamic power. You might be wondering why I took this detour in history so far back. That's because I wanted to explain to you the name Strait of Hormuz or Hormuz Strait. That the Zoroastrian or the Parsi tradition or the Parsi history is still very much alive there, and Strait of Hormuz is a very good example of that. Parsis, as we know, the largest population of Parsis, they escaped to India, and this is where they've thrived since then. Very few survive in Iran. Now, this Strait of Hormuz, again, look at the map. If you look at the map, Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf, you can choose, that looks like a very large swimming pool. A very large swimming pool on the map of the world, maybe an Olympic-sized swimming pool, but entry to that from the Arabian Sea, Gulf of Oman on the western side and Arabian Sea southwards, the entry to that is through this very tiny inlet which comes in like this. This is almost a U-shaped inlet. That is the strait between an Omanese territory. Now you might say, where is Oman? Oman's a little bit of a distance away. That's because Oman has its exclave here called Musandam Peninsula. See it on the map, Musandam Peninsula. Between that and the Iranian territory, this is very narrow. I will give you some dimensions of the Gulf of Hormuz because this is what Iranians have said that they have blocked, they are blocking. They will fire at any ship going through it. What happens is that the strait is so narrow that at one point, this is almost entirely either Oman's territorial waters or Iran's territorial waters. We will understand this better once we know the dimensions. The strait itself is about 90 nautical miles. I will give you figures in all three measures: nautical miles, miles, and kilometers, because many of us think in different terms. 90 nautical miles or 104 miles or 167 kilometers. That's the entire length of this strait. But what is the width? The important part is, what is the width? If we look at the width, the widest the strait is 97 kilometers or 60 miles or 52 nautical miles. But the narrowest is 21 nautical miles or 24 miles or 39 kilometers. That's really narrow. Remember, 12 nautical miles is any country's territorial water. So if you look at the narrowest point of the strait, it does not even cover for what could be the two countries' territorial waters. Of course, there are laws of the seas which determine these things, but basically it tells you that Iranians are sitting right on top of this narrowest point, and that is the reason this becomes the most significant choke point in global shipping, particularly global energy shipping. There are other choke points. There is Bab el Mandab, which is not very far, which is again the other side of Oman. You go to Yemen, and that's again a narrow one, and that's where the Houthis had stopped global shipping some time back. That's, however, not so critical for energy as Strait of Hormuz is. Then, of course, we have the other choke point, Malacca Strait, and couple around Turkey between Black Sea and the Mediterranean, but that is going too far. This is what matters right now, and this is the most important in the world. Now, what happens if you understand something called bathymetry? Bathymetry is the science of studying the ocean floors and basically checking out the depth. If you look at the bathymetric chart of Strait of Hormuz, it's not that deep. At its deepest, it's about 200, 300 meters. It is therefore, given how narrow it is and given how shallow it is in a way, relatively so, it is deep enough for the largest super tankers to pass. It's deep enough for the largest aircraft carriers to pass. However, it is still shallow enough for somebody to drop anti-ship mines, and those mines then are difficult to find. It takes specialized craft to find those mines, and also you can fire at shipping going through this tiny vestibule from the coast, from behind the coast, from a bunch of islands that the Iranians have in that area, particularly island called Sheshm, which is a very large island, populated. The Iranians have a whole network of missiles, air defenses, drone stations there. They've really turned these islands into porcupine style fortresses. I'm sure they will receive a lot of attention from US and Israeli air power, more the US air power. But even if you look behind it, if you go deeper into Iranian hinterland in this area, you go to Zagros Mountains. First of all, it's one of the most desolate regions of the world. If you've flown Europe from India, in good times when you could fly over Pakistan, Balochistan, this area was among the driest and the most desolate you found on that route. The Zagros Mountains also have the Dana Range, after which the ill-fated Iranian Navy frigate was named. This is also the mountains that you see from air, where you see loads of ice, particularly in winter time. It is in these mountains that the Iranians can easily base their missile launchers, drone launchers, and in such asymmetric warfare, the defender usually has a much greater advantage than the attacker. Also, the history of naval warfare tells you that even in the past, those defending these narrow passages have actually been quite successful or have inflicted a great deal of damage on those trying to break through. You can go right back to First World War, the Battle of Gallipoli, where the Allied power tried to break through and reach Istanbul or Constantinople, but they failed. Gallipoli was considered a Turkish victory, although the Ottomans lost in the end, but the Turkish commander at Gallipoli, Kemal Atatürk, he emerged a hero and he became a kind of successor to the Ottomans. 1923, he had taken over as the great leader of Turkey. After him, in fact, one of the major avenues is named also in New Delhi in the diplomatic conclave. Defending such narrow passages, therefore, I'm not saying it's easy, but a determined defender can suck in a much larger power, because what happens is a determined defender entices you to bring your vessels close to the coast, and when that happens, you come in the range of multiple kinds of vectors, from mines to drones to missiles of various kinds, and those missiles could be launched from many places. And warships are very expensive. In some ways, they are very delicate because they have a lot on their surface to lose, particularly radars, missiles, missile launchers, etc. That's why in 1987-88, the last time the American Navy carried out tanker escort duties here, that is when Iraq and Iran were fighting, and they were trying to stop oil supplies or oil sales from each other. So Iraqis thought if they could stop Iranian oil from going out, Iranian economy will suffer and they'll be weakened, and vice versa. In that war, Americans decided to escort Kuwaiti ships. Even in that operation called Ernestville, American Navy craft were on the other side of the tanker. They were not on the side of the tanker that faced the Iranian coast. They were always other side of the tanker, going in and coming out. In fact, once again, I'll take you back to the strait where it's very narrow. In the narrowest part, two lanes are demarcated. Two 3.2 kilometer lanes are demarcated. One for going in, ships going in, one for ships coming out. These are very large ships. You don't want a traffic jam there. And between the two lanes also, there is a 3.2 kilometer gap, a through 3.2 kilometer empty channel that is like a lane separator. So this is a very crowded area, very crowded area. In normal times, good times, we've seen about 138 ships, mostly tankers, pass through this channel per day. Now it's down to low single digits. It has to be really a very adventurous captain to decide to go this way. In fact, even today, a Thai tanker passing through the channel got hit by Iranian drones. The other complication that the Americans have, that under American law, American Navy cannot escort ships which are not American or allied to America. NATO ships, all right, but not unallied ships. So even in 1987-88, Kuwaiti Navy agreed to fly American flags on their tankers to give America the cover. That is not available now. This will need either changes going to the Congress, which Trump would not like to do. That is the reason the Americans have not yet put this ban into effect. Although Chris Wright, the American secretary, said in a tweet just a day back that the first tanker has now been escorted out by American Navy ships, but later that tweet was deleted, and the Speaker of the Iranian parliament mocked him by asking, "Oh, where was it done? On PlayStation." Americans as yet have not started escorting anything through this passage, and even to do that will be quite challenging. What they've started right now is to attack wherever they can find Iranian mine-laying vessels. Iranian have some mine-laying vessels. 16 of them have already been sunk. That's what the Central Command, US Central Command said. They also put out videos of 9 being sunk. However, the Iranians don't necessarily need mine-laying vessels to lay these. They can use any chota vessels, fast attack craft. They have many of them. Even normal Arabian-style dhows to lay these mines, because each one can drop 1, 2, 3, 4 mines. A mine can be devastating, and to clear these is a task. Now, Americans have specialized vessels to do this, and those will be used. Those vessels then employ unmanned submersibles, which can look sideways, which can look down. The old generation minesweepers actually were made of wood. The hull was made of wood, and the bottoms are made of glass. That is one, to see, and second also to minimize the damage in case you were hit by a mine. The Americans, as we know, have taken all of those out of the Gulf, and those are now earmarked for disposal. There are more modern vessels available. However, you can never be sure that no mine survives. That is what I meant when I said the Iranian strategy is to convert these islands and the coastal regions also into kind of porcupine fortresses. Now, what happens if this blockade continues? If the Americans are not able to break it, Israelis won't be able to do. They don't have the wherewithal. They also will not be interested. Americans have to do it. Suppose they are not able to do it, how come all this while the Arab countries have not tried to find solutions? So it's not as if they haven't tried to find. The Saudis have built a pipeline which goes from their side of the Persian Gulf to the other side, that means into the Red Sea. So this begins at a place called Abqaiq, which is an oil producing center, and from there the pipeline, which can at its maximum carry 5 million barrels per day, to the western coast on Red Sea to a port called Yanbu. Now the fact is that when oil and gas are emptied there, will they come south and come towards Asia where the big consumers are, or will they go towards Europe, because that is much safer? Then they don't have to cross Bab el Mandab, and then they don't have to worry about the Houthis. In any case, all of the world wants Middle Eastern oil. There is the other pipeline that the UAE has built, and that's a much smaller pipeline that takes about 1/3 of this much crude to Fujairah oil terminals. See the map. Fujairah is an emirate under the UAE that opens out in the Gulf of Oman. Once again, both of these cannot quite fulfill the needs of the rest of the world. If you see the LNG coming out of the Middle East, more than 20% of that is bought by the Chinese, 15% by us in India, 6.6% by Pakistan, 3.6% by Bangladesh. We are very energy hungry countries, which will all be affected by any continuing blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. We've talked about strategic, geopolitical, and military issues. there's one more thing left, and I can't let you go without a little bit of geology. How did this strange feature of geography come into being? You have to go right back about 180 to 200 million years back. That is when the great Gondwana supercontinent, of which we were a part, the great Gondwana supercontinent, called so because the fossils establishing that this supercontinent existed, have been found in the Gondwana region of Madhya Pradesh, our Madhya Pradesh. The big Gondwana supercontinent split 180 to 200 million years ago. That Arabian plate broke away, and in the course of time, it moved northwards, more distant from the Gondwana plate. Gondwana plate was meanwhile going through its own changes, creating mountains like the Himalayas, etc., and other oceans. Because of the movement of the Arabian plate now, a large new sea called Neotethys formed. That was the space between the Arabian and the Eurasian plate. Then you come to more recent times, from 180 to 200 million years. What is more recent? More recent is 25 million years. 25 million years in the Cenozoic period, there was a collision between the Arabian and Eurasian plate. And that collision again brought about geological changes. One of the changes was also, as they hit each other, was the creation, because they pressed against each other, they collided. It was the creation of the Zagros mountain. That was 25 million years ago. And then we come to the most recent period. And this collision, the force of this collision, which pushed back and created the Zagros mountains. This also created a basin in front of the Zagros mountains, because after all this stuff got pushed up to make the mountains, so the space opened up in front. That space became part of the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz. Finally, the most recent, which was, what is the most recent? 500,000 years ago. Something started 200 million years ago, changed dramatically 25 million years ago, and then 500,000 years ago, there was one more change that was in the Pleistocene era. And this is when the weight of the rising Zagros mountains made the crust in front of them to buckle and sink. And that is what gifted the world Strait of Hormuz. Now you can say gifted because this strait allows the world to take out this oil and gas from the Middle East. For anybody living in that region and sharing this coastline, it could also be a strategic gift. That is what exactly the Iranians have used it for, and that is what the Americans are not finding any answer to right now. And that's the reason all the rest of the world right now is concerned. India is also concerned, looking at LPG, LNG shortages, or worrying about them, etc.